So, welcome everybody to 3 ways to empower your students to love writing. Today, you're going to learn why so many students find writing intimidating, as well as 3 solutions for making writing empowering and enjoyable for students of all ages. My name is Hayley Milliman, and I am the content lead here at ProWritingAid. And before that, I was an English teacher. So I worked in public schools for 3 years, working as an English teacher for students who were in a low-income background, who often hadn't had a lot of exposure to writing. And I worked with students at both the elementary and middle school level, many of whom were very far behind on their reading level and really just found that writing was very difficult and very intimidating for them. And so during my years as a teacher and as the English language department chair head, it was my job to figure out ways to make writing as engaging as possible. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, how we can make writing engaging and not scary for our students, no matter what academic background they have, or what levels they're working with and what their comfort with writing is. All right, so for those of you who are teachers, maybe this sounds familiar, or even for those of you who have been students before and are now writing as experts yourself, or as teachers, or just as freelance writers in general. So maybe this sounds familiar to you. Writing assignments with your students feels like pulling teeth. And every time your student has to write, he or she puts up a fight. So if you're managing a classroom of students, this is very, very common. Or even if you're homeschooling your students, it might feel like constantly you're struggling to get your student to want to write, your child to want to write, and it just feels like a constant fight. Maybe it also sounds familiar that you spend more time correcting your students or group of students' grammar and spelling than giving feedback on the substance of their ideas. So when you finally get work back, when you finally get them to write and you get that assignment back, you're sitting there and you're looking at it and you're just correcting spelling errors, you're correcting sentence structure errors. You're really not giving too much feedback on the ideas that that student has presented or that your child has presented, because you're spending all of your time focusing on grammar and spelling. It also might sound familiar that you are unsure about giving effective feedback. So if you're a teacher who works in a number of different areas, so perhaps you're an elementary or middle school teacher with multiple subject areas, or you're a homeschooling parent who's trying to give your child feedback, you might not be sure whether or not you can give effective feedback. Most of us are not subject matter experts in writing, especially as teachers, even if we're trained English teachers. A lot of times there are areas that we are stronger in and areas that we are not as strong in. And so you're not and then if you're a homeschooling parent who is homeschooling your student either for the first time this year or in the past, it can be really difficult to know, am I giving the correct feedback? Am I giving feedback that's effective and that's right? Or am I going to reinforce some incorrect beliefs of my student? If any of those resonated with you, I want you to know that you're not alone. Again, whether you're a homeschooling parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're just writing for yourself and thinking about the feedback process, you are not alone. It's very, very normal to feel that giving writing feedback is scary and challenging. Many students and educators find writing challenging. It's something that scares us. It's something that feels like pulling teeth, that when we sit down to do it, it feels intimidating. Honestly, that's how writing feels to me, and I write every day for work. Writing is really hard, and writing well is really hard. And so figuring out how you can make writing engaging is what we're going to do today. So far, we've talked all about why or what kind of behaviors would manifest when students avoid writing. So they might not want to start their assignments. They might turn in assignments that have lots of mistakes. As the educator who has that relationship with them, you might be stressed out about that. And that's because a lot of students want to avoid writing. Here's why. First, many students feel pressure to write perfectly, so they never even start. I'm honestly guilty of this as an adult who works, again, in writing constantly. I am always worried about the pressure of writing perfectly. I want to make my first draft great. And so when I feel like I can't make my first draft great, I don't even want to start at all. And that's how many students feel, especially students who are newer to the writing process. They know that they're going to get feedback back, which we'll talk about in a second. And so because that, they don't even want to start. They feel like they don't even know where to begin. Now, that ties into our second point. Many students are demoralized when they receive negative feedback, even if that feedback isn't like, oh, this is wrong or this is bad. Even receiving corrections, right? Getting a paper back covered in red pen where they've missed commas or periods, that feels demoralizing and quite frankly scary for many students. And so they know that they're going to get that negative feedback back. They know that they can't write perfectly, and so they just don't want to begin. Students often tend to feel overwhelmed by the writing process as well. So as we all know, writing requires many steps. You have to have an idea. You have to have an outline. You have to draft an introduction. You have to follow that introduction up with body paragraphs. Within each of those paragraphs, you need to have thesis statements and supporting evidence, all of these types of things. And so that process can be really overwhelming and scary for many students. And so they think, I can't possibly manage this process. I can't possibly write perfectly, so I'll never even start. Then, students also tend to avoid writing because the assignments feel pointless and boring. For many students, what they're writing about feels inapplicable to their daily life, or they might be writing about something and they'll say, I'm never going to use this skill again. So why am I doing this? And so that kind of feeling of frustration builds up in many students as well. And then finally, students feel that their work is never done. And so they might spend hours and hours and hours working on writing, but they still get feedback back. And that's still, it's still never that 100%, that A, that perfect paper that they're searching for. So they just don't want to start in the beginning or to begin with. If any of these resonate with you in your experience working either with your students or with children or even with yourself, let me know in the comments. Do these resonate with you? Okay, great. Yeah, someone's saying that working with their students is really challenging and they often have a hard time. Students are groaning whenever they open up an assignment to write or whenever they have a writing assignment for the day. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then someone else is saying that they always have students just like skipping through writing assignments, so never going through or never completing them, and they're doing their assignments in pieces, and so they never get a full assignment back. Yeah, and then someone saying that they teach law school and that the students are very stressed about their grades on writing papers. Definitely. That's very common. Turning in a writing assignment is extremely nerve-wracking for many students, and it's a lot of it because of this process. It requires so many steps. They're worried about that negative feedback. No matter how much time that you've spent on something, they're worried that it's going to come back imperfectly. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, it seems like this is a common thread that teaching writing is difficult, or even assigning writing, even if you're teaching in something adjacent like law school and where there's a lot of writing to be done, but you're not actually a writing teacher. This whole writing process is very stressful for everyone, no matter where your relationship is in the writing process. So fortunately, it is possible to empower students to love feedback. Oh, Martin says that their student love feedback, which is awesome. Great, Martin. And maybe you're doing some of the things that you have in here. So we'll talk about some of the strategies to get them to love feedback soon, which is great. Sorry, skipped forward. But yes, it's totally possible to empower your students to love writing. And just like Martin did, to empower your students to love feedback as well. And it's all about how you deliver it and how you make that part of your process, which we'll talk about today. So my 3 ways to empower your students to love writing are: first, to give students agency over their writing; second, to build writing into all subjects; and third, to create a robust feedback loop. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. So these are all real strategies that I used in the classroom. They're also all real strategies that fellow teachers that I know who are still practicing use today. The goal here is to teach strategies that you can start implementing, again, whether they're with your child, whether they're with yourself, whether they're with a group of university students, whoever they're with, these strategies can work today. Okay, so our first step is to give students agency over their writing whenever possible. So for many students, writing feels like a loss of control, and that's why they do not like to do it. They struggle to remember how to start and format their work. They can't write about what they would like, and they feel slow and inefficient balancing the mechanics of writing, word choice, grammar, spelling, with the idea of expressing their ideas. So they're struggling between all of this. They can't choose what they want to write about. They can't remember all of the different ways that they need to format and start and bolster their arguments. And then all of these mechanics are challenging for them to remember. So instead of writing, again, whenever possible, instead of making writing educator directed, the goal is to make it student centered instead, which basically means whenever possible, you want to give your students choices about what they're writing about. So for instance, they might need to write a persuasive essay as part of their curriculum. That makes sense. But you don't have to choose the topic of that persuasive essay for them. You can empower them to write about something they care about, a topic that they want to defend, no matter how seemingly trivial. So, if you're working with high school students and they have to write a persuasive essay for the end of their high school writing class, maybe their persuasive essay is about why Fruit Loops are the best cereal. It doesn't really matter. The goal here is to get them to feel comfortable with the structure and the practice of writing, and not worry as much about the topic when you can have flexibility in that. If you're working at a college level course, for instance, if you have the ability to change up or to give your students flexibility in their end of term papers, that is always preferred to, again, assigning a very, very strict lens. So whenever possible, again, loosening the reins on topic so that your students have more freedom to play around within a particular form. The other thing that you can do to give students agency is to model as much as possible. So you always want to model so that your students know what to write and how to write it. You never want to give them an assignment without first reviewing a sample and then working through pieces together. The goal of this is to have a feedback loop that's I do, then we do, and then you do. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a second. But modeling is extremely important to build your students' confidence so they know what to expect. And depending on the grade level that you're teaching and the writing that you're expecting, modeling could look very different. So for Anne, who's teaching law school, and whose students are stressed about grades on their writing papers, modeling is going to look a little bit different than if you were teaching, how to craft an essay in 6th grade. But modeling at that level could look like giving them examples of papers that have been done well and walking through, what was done well on that paper versus what was not done well, so that they have something to see and something to base theirs off of. You don't necessarily have to do that live at the college level. You could just give them like a bank of texts at the beginning of the year that they can look forward to or look through. But the goal here is, again, to give them something that they can see and they can say, okay, this is what I want to model towards. Martin has a great question in the chat, which is it risky or bad to use to use both good and bad model texts, or should I only stick to the good ones? Martin, I would highly encourage you to use both good and bad model texts. Having students be able to compare what a good text looks like versus what a bad text looks like is really helpful in building their confidence, and also in them having the ability to self-edit their own work. That being said, I always want to, be careful with how you're modeling a bad model text. So you don't necessarily want to call it bad when you're modeling it, but like looking at what can be improved in that text, and having a good text versus a bad text to compare against can be really, really helpful for them to see, okay, like here are places to improve. And I would encourage you, whenever you're using model text, whether the text is excellent or the text is, struggling, always look for places that they can improve. So even on those good model texts, you should have your students do some analysis of, what makes this text good. Are there places that it can be improved? Because one of the things we'll talk about today is how writing really isn't ever done. And so encouraging your students to feel confident in that, and to feel confident that everyone can receive feedback no matter how good their text is, I think is another good point to have there. So again, I would highly recommend having them practice analysis on both good and bad model text. Again, that will build that kind of self-editing piece for themselves. So they'll be able to look back at their text and they'll say, oh, okay, I've analyzed a number of different texts. Here's how mine compares, and here are what my next steps are. Okay, so here is what the I do, we do, you do model looks like. And again, this is at a kind of secondary school level, but there are different versions of this as you go all the way up through postgraduate work. So the first goal is to model yourself, you doing as the instructor, whether you're the parent, whether you're the professor. You want to model doing it yourself and what you're looking for. So setting your expectations. So if this was, again, a high school English class, the first thing you could do is model how to write a thesis statement. And you want to point out what makes something strong. That's the key point there. You don't want to just do it for them, but you want to show exactly why. So showing that why behind it will help them understand. After you've done it yourself, then you want to spend time with the group or with your student together, where you're working together on something and giving active feedback in this process. So you're crafting an active, if you're working with a high school class, you're crafting a thesis statement, and maybe you're calling on students to fill in certain parts of it. And then you're calling on other students to give feedback on those parts. But really you're co-creating something here in the we do stage. If this is looking at a larger model text, maybe you are giving students an assignment, they're reading through it, noting down what they liked, what they disliked, and then you're coming back together as a group to review that. So this is a little bit of a release of control, where you're starting to let them work independently, but you're still supporting them and they're supporting each other here, right? So by the time they get to the you do section, they've had numerous times to practice this skill by themselves. So first they've been able to, they've gotten your model where you've worked through exactly what you're looking for and what makes it good. Then they're doing it with their peers, they're doing it with the class together, and getting and participating in that active feedback loop. And then finally, by the time they go to do it themselves, they've had all of these inputs that really make them feel confident in what they're doing. And in each parts of this, they're also getting feedback on, what works well, what doesn't well, and then they can self-edit as well. So like Martin and I were just talking about, if they have active feedback as part of the class, then they'll be more likely to self-assess their own work as to whether or not it's successful or whether or not they should make edits. So this model and this release of control slowly helps students feel more confident about starting. And that way they're not looking at a blank page and saying, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. They have the skills and they've built up and practiced those skills by the time they're moving independently. Now, I always want to say that, grammar, style, and spelling are important, but many adults are struggling with these too. So when you're writing and when you're thinking about agency, we always want to empower students to focus on their ideas and then provide them with the tools to edit grammar, style, and spelling. So even when I was working with students who really were, many reading levels behind where they should be, and were really developing writing skills, even though they were, in middle school or that type of age, that doesn't mean that they don't have ideas. So having those ideas and being able to practice and communicate those ideas, even if the grammar, style, and spelling aren't quite right, that's really important. And so leading with this kind of agency idea of giving students power over their ideas is really, really key. We'll teach them how to do the grammar, style, and spelling later, but our first goal is to have students, no matter what their writing ability, their technical writing ability is, to focus on their ideas first. And then Anne asked a question, can students learn to write if they write papers in teams? Yes, Anne, fully believe that they do, but it has to be given with clear and explicit instructions. So giving clear and explicit instructions about what an effective team looks like, I think is very important. I always think that students are able to support each other and to give each other feedback, and feedback from a peer is many times much more or much less scary, and in some ways more effective than feedback from an instructor. So giving students that opportunity is great, but the expectations have to be clear. And if we go back to the slide before that, the I do, we do, you do, you want to build like all of your instructions with this kind of lens. So it's not enough to just say, hey, here's a team of 5 people, go write a paper on this. That's going to result in probably one person doing all the work, the other people, maybe squabbling amongst themselves, that type of thing. However, if you model exactly how you want them to break that down, then you're more likely to get effective team results. And what I mean by that is saying, okay, here's what we do first. You write your introduction to the brief, and then these 2 people will be giving feedback. This person is writing. And so giving, those explicit instructions that, hey, Martin's going to write the first section, then Anne and Fyodor will give him feedback on that, and then Martin will rewrite. And the next section, Anne will write, and then Fyodor and Martin will give her feedback on that, and then she'll rewrite. And really being very clear about how you break things down is the best way to approach teamwork. If you leave it up to the students themselves, a lot of times they'll get confused. Again, someone will take ownership and then they might just do all the work themselves, and then other people aren't really learning. So teamwork can be an effective learning experience, but it really needs to have boundaries in order for that to happen. Okay. So we talked all about giving students agency. And again, agency means, first of all, being able to write about what they like within whatever parameters you can give them. The second is about giving them the agency to understand their assignment. And that's where that modeling comes in. Agency is not always about total freedom. It's also about understanding what you're doing and being able to move forward with it. So again, in the I do, you do, we do, that gives them that agency because it's giving them some freedom. Like Anne and I were just talking about, giving strict roles actually gives students more agency because then they can operate within that role rather than making something up and it kind of missing the mark, or it putting them into conflict with the other people on their team. So agency is very important. The next thing that you want to do is build writing into all subjects and use it as much as possible. So as adults, we know that we write all the time. We write in the Zoom chat right here. We write PowerPoint presentations. We write emails. We write texts. We write letters. We are writing all the time, even if we're not formally working on an essay or a novel or a blog post. We are writing constantly to communicate. And that's what we should model for our students as well. The more writing that your students do and the more practicing that they do, the less intimidating writing will feel. You should be building in writing into all parts of your academic practice, and giving students time to write without specific expectations will make them feel more comfortable with the process. Here's an example of what this could look like in, again, a secondary school. So in science, you have them keep lab notes and findings. And the goal here, again, isn't to look through their lab notes and see anything specifically, but to have them just practice writing so that when they get that notebook and when they're told that they have to do a writing assignment for English class, it doesn't feel scary. In social studies, they could keep a journal about what it would feel like to live in different parts of history. Again, this can be just free writing. It's just getting them used to that practice. In math, maybe they're noting how they solved a particular problem, or explaining what they liked versus what they didn't like. Same thing in PE. They can say, hey, this is what happened here. This is what didn't happen. The goal here, again, is to build writing as much as possible into all parts of your practice and really build informal writing. All of us as teachers, We'll have certain kind of summative writing assessments, whether that's an end of term paper, whether that's, something that they do every week if they're in a secondary school and the pace is higher. We will have those summative assessments, but those summative assessments will lose their kind of fear if you write more and more and more before that. So even, Anne, as a law professor or somebody who's working in university, if you're doing weekly writing assignments and just giving quick feedback, that will get your students used to the writing kind of cycle and used to writing for your class and what you're looking for. So that way that final term paper doesn't feel as scary. Now, the goal here is not necessarily to, again, as I said, look for ideas here and perfect grammar or spelling, because that would just add a huge amount of work on us and the students and that type of thing. The goal is just to build that writing muscle, to build that writing practice. So it could just be a completion. They could fill out a form, and then if they filled it out, they get the check mark and it's all automated and that type of thing. The goal, again, for this is not to write perfectly or not to write for a specific purpose, but to just mimic the type and the amount of writing that students will do once they get into the real world. For the vast majority of jobs, they will have to write, and the more that they build that kind of like, this is what I was writing, this is what I was doing, today, will just make them feel ultimately more comfortable, so that when they get to those final summative assessments where you are grading them on their ideas and their execution, it doesn't feel quite as scary. They're at that point used to it. You can even, in certain parts of this, mimic real world writing. So you could set up like a texting app for your students, or a messaging platform like Slack or something like that for your classroom, where they are talking to each other the way they would at work. You could have, if your classroom has, your students have emails, which many schools do these days, you could have them email themselves or email someone else about what they liked about PE or what they did in social studies. Or you could have them set up a blog post for their social studies classroom that's written as a character. There's just many, many ways where you can kind of mimic, again, the writing that they'll do in real life, so that writing doesn't feel quite so esoteric and so so unusable in the real world. And then again, it's also building that muscle so that they don't stare down their final summative assessment and say, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? At that point, they're used to writing, they've built that muscle, and they're ready to move forward with it. Whenever you have your students writing, you want to empower them to start to make self-edits. We'll talk about how to do this with ProWritingAid shortly, but the goal here is to let students edit their own work in these informal situations so that these types of edits become second nature and less intimidating. So again, the goal here is to empower your students to do this themselves, not for you to spend hours and hours looking at journal entries about what it was like to live in Victorian England. The goal is for your students to be able to do that themselves in these informal practices. So that way, again, when they get to that final summative assessment, they're used to receiving feedback from themselves and they're used to editing their own work. And then again, your edits do not feel quite so scary. Okay. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about creating a robust feedback loop, because that's really the key piece here. So feedback, there's no getting around it. Feedback feels icky. I feel icky when I get feedback to this day, even when it's good. I feel super nervous about, if someone tells me they have feedback for me, even good feedback, I feel scared. Even like looking through this today with the attendees that I have here, I'm always like, oh my gosh, I hope the feedback in the chat is good. So feedback is scary. We're all scared about that. But the only way to make it feel less icky and less scary is to normalize it. The more feedback you get and the more you're used to receiving feedback, the less scary it will be, and the more likely your students are to accept it and know how to take action from that. So if they only receive feedback from you on their writing at the very end of the semester, at the very end of the year, then they will be terrified. However, if they are receiving feedback up to that point, they will A, know what kind of feedback to expect from you, know what the character of it is, know what you give, and B, just be expecting it. It'll be part of day-to-day life rather than this big thing that they've, placed, this like big thing that they've placed up at the top of a mountain that they're so nervous about climbing up to get. So the more they're used to feedback, the more they will expect it and know what to do with it. Feedback can be very, very paralyzing if you don't expect it, but it's also the best way for us to move forward and to make and improve our work. So if we get more feedback, we'll improve our work, but the only way to do that is to give feedback constantly throughout the process. Now, writing feedback is particularly challenging as educators to give. It is incredibly time consuming to give feedback on essays. The first thing to do that's challenging about it is just giving feedback on ideas, right? Students who put effort into creating an essay that they've worked on for weeks or months, they want to get feedback on those ideas. But if you as the educator are staring at a paper that's riddled with spelling and grammar errors, it can be really challenging to want to give feedback on ideas. You might just be like, I've got to add the period here. This word was misspelled. They used the wrong form of there. This is driving me crazy. I need to fix it. And so you get kind of bogged down in those quick spelling and grammar errors, and then you never get to give feedback on the substance of your students' ideas. It's also challenging if you're not a subject matter expert. So if you're a teacher in secondary school or high school and you're trying to give feedback on something that you're trying to give writing feedback, but you're not a writing expert, how do you know what to say? That's really challenging too. And then, like I said, giving writing feedback is just so time consuming. It takes a lot of time to read through and give meaningful feedback, especially if you're staring at a paper that has a bunch of just technical errors. Then you'll never get a chance to concentrate on the ideas, which are the core of what the students need to improve. And then the student experience is negative too. It's really, really disheartening to receive a paper that's covered in red pen, especially if that red pen is just correcting errors and it's not giving idea feedback back. I remember when I was a student, I would really appreciate feedback that, if my professor got to kind of write, sometimes they would write comments to me at the end of my essay, or they would write comments in the margin where there were multiple, sentences. And so I could tell at that point that they were really engaging with the ideas that I put out there. I hated when I would get feedback that looks like this in this picture, where they're just kind of circling things or crossing stuff out, and there's just not any of that feedback, again, on the substance of my ideas, because that just felt like, oh, Hayley, you've made a mistake, you're wrong, you're stupid. Whereas when they're engaging with my ideas, it tells me that they're thinking critically about what I've put out there and that my ideas are worth that engagement. But again, going back as an educator, it's really, really challenging to do that when your paper has those spelling and grammar errors because you can't get to the ideas. So the goal here will be to create a feedback loop where your students are empowered to correct their own grammar and spelling so that they're then able to, you as an educator and the student are then able to focus on those ideas and give back that feedback that really challenges them and has them grow rather than just makes them feel bad. So I'm going to talk about how that works with ProWritingAid. And specifically, I think that using editing technology at this point to get that grammar and spelling polished is really, really key, because as an educator, you're just always going to be spending your time. You're always going to be spending your time correcting that stuff, those missing periods, those misplaced commas, that type of thing, unless you have a tool that can help you do that yourself. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with ProWritingAid, it's an editing technology that can help students make spelling and grammar and style corrections, and that frees you up to give feedback on what really matters. Today, since I work for ProWritingAid, I'm going to show you how to do it in ProWritingAid, but you can use any other editing technology. I think ours is the best, clearly, but there are many that you can use. And the goal here, again, is to get students used to receiving feedback as they're writing. And in this case, the feedback is coming from the editing technology. So they're getting this first round of feedback from their work on those grammar, style, and spelling errors. And then you as the educator come in at the end, at the back end, and give them feedback on what really matters, which are their ideas. Okay, so I am in ProWritingAid now, and I'm going to show you guys what this looks like for a creative nonfiction piece. So ProWritingAid is a grammar checker, a style checker, and a spelling checker. And again, like I said, you can use any type of editing technology. So you could use your spell check in Word, you could use another program. But the goal here is again, to get them used to receiving these types of feedback. So when you use an editing technology with your students, they'll be used to having words underlined, and they'll be able to go through and make these corrections so that by the time the paper gets to you, they've made all of their corrections on their style, spelling, and grammar, and you're again focusing on the ideas specifically. A couple pieces that are great about ProWritingAid are that all of the pieces within ProWritingAid come with these little explanations, which can explain to your students why the tool is suggesting these corrections. So that way they can do some of the self-editing and self-learning as they're writing specifically. So it can be really useful for them to learn exactly what's going on and how to fix it. There are also numerous different reports that can help them do, again, fix everything from their style errors to their sentence length, their transition structure, all of that type of thing. But being able to do it through a software like this, which gives them more specific feedback, can be very, very useful. And again, it gets them used to seeing these corrections. And part of what we want to do here with the feedback loop is not just have corrections at the very end. Corrections should be part of the writing process. And the more that you make them part of the writing process, the more used to that they'll be. I also want to encourage you, for students as young as second or third grade, to use a writing technology, whether it's, again, Google Docs or anything that has, again, these kind of spelling checkers. Using that with your students and empowering them to be tech enabled is really, really key to creating this feedback loop, and again, to increasing their comfort with any of this. Students as young as I've worked with students as young as second grade in a program like Google Docs or Microsoft Word with spelling and grammar tools. The goal, again, is not to just release them into it, but to model using that I do, you do, we do. So that structure of gradual release, which we talked about before, will be important for using an editing technology like this too. So you don't want to just drop this on them and say, hey, start using ProWritingAid, good luck, especially if they're 7. You want to show them what they're going to be doing and how they can use it properly. So what I would do is I would take my students through a program like this, just the same way I'm doing now with all of you, show them which suggestions I accept, which suggestions I leave, how the mechanics of the technology works, so that they're able to use it effectively themselves. Then you could, again, if they're younger students, they might need a little bit more of a release of control. So maybe you have them work on a group document together, and then finally you release them to do it themselves. If they're older, they might need less of the we do with editing technology, but again, either providing that direct instruction on how to use it yourself, or giving them tools. If you're teaching university and you wanted your students to use ProWritingAid, you might just be able to send them our own how-to materials, because they can navigate those themselves. But again, younger students will need that direct feedback and direct instruction to learn how to use it. But again, the goal here is to normalize feedback, normalize receiving feedback as part of the writing process, normalize the idea that feedback will make your work better. You should embrace it. And then again, not leave it to the very end so that they just get a paper back at the end and have no idea what they should expect. The more feedback they receive up front, the more comfortable they'll feel with what you're getting at the end, and the more they'll know what to expect and not feel like it comes out of nowhere. So here's just a couple things that ProWritingAid has, which we talked about before. They have an achievements report as well that you can get, which gives them insight into what they have accepted. We talked about the demonstration. And so to close today, before we get to questions, the 3 main goals in empowering your students to love writing are, first, to give them agency over their writing. And agency, again, means agency in terms of topic choice, but also agency in terms of their actions. They should be able to write by themselves, and they should be empowered to write by themselves. And the way to do that is to release control through direct instruction with your group, and then finally an independent practice. So direct instruction where you're modeling what you want, group instruction where you're working with groups and teams to do that, to accomplish that task together, and then finally releasing them to independent control. So by the time they get there, they've gone through multiple rounds of practice and they know exactly what to do. That gives them agency. It's empowering for your students. You should also build writing into all subjects or into all exercises as much as possible. So showing your students, we're going to write in everything, even if it's not graded, even if it's not looked at, but just building writing into all subjects and building writing in a way that makes sense for what they're doing. So again, you could set up emails for your students if they're younger. You could set up a blog. You could have them interact in ways that makes the writing feel applicable to what they're going to do when they're actually practicing out in the real world, whatever they're practicing. And then finally, give feedback as much as possible. And as a teacher, it's pretty much impossible to be giving feedback on grammar, style, and spelling all the time, which is why you can use an editing technology like ProWritingAid to get them used to receiving feedback, get them used to receiving suggestions, and then also empowering them so that they know what to do with those suggestions when they get them. So they're used to saying, okay, I get feedback, I take action from here. Action in the ProWritingAid tool looks like accepting or ignoring suggestions, but then action when I get feedback back from my instructor looks like this. And again, creating that robust feedback loop really takes away some of that terror of submitting a writing assignment. And just really makes the process more enjoyable for everyone else. And then when you're using an editing technology like ProWritingAid, that frees you up as the instructor to engage with them on their ideas and to really engage with them on an intellectual level rather than just kind of a red pen level here and there. All right, so I think we've got a couple questions that have come through. We have plenty of time, so if you guys have any, you can use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go ahead and dive into questions. So first up, we have one from Asha that says, what's the best way to come up with a paper topic? Free writing, which is an awesome question, Asha. It really depends on what type of paper that you're trying to write, but I do recommend free writing, or at least just kind of journaling or getting down things that you might be interested in. If you do have that freedom that I was talking about, that agency to choose your own topic, what you can do is go through, jot down all the things that you're interested in, then do a little bit of research on them, and then come back and see if any of them stick with you, and if you'd like to learn more about any of them. So free writing can definitely be a very, very useful exercise. Jotting down ideas is also a great exercise. And then again, this is where like the modeling from the instructor comes in handy. If an instructor shows you a lot of like what good examples of assignments were before in previous grade assignments, that can help kind of jog your interest in things too. I always like to see modeled papers because I'm like, oh, I can write about this and that type of thing. All right, other questions? Let me just grab the chat too. Okay, someone asked to go over the I do, we do, you do again. So I'm just going to skip back to that slide really quickly. So again, the I do, you do, or I do, we do, you do is all about releasing control and showing students what to do before they do it themselves. So you first want to model, and modeling can look like doing it yourself. It can look like analyzing it yourself. It can look like both. So for instance, if you were writing a thesis statement, you want to write the thesis statement and then point out what makes it strong. Again, that key second piece of analyzing will help them understand what to do well. You could also, again, this works for writing, but it works for any other subject as well. It works for math, so the first time you want to do a math problem, you want to show your students how you did something and why you did it that way, which is helpful. Then you always want to add this like group instruction together where you're doing it with your students. Again, depending on the structure of your class, this could look like them working in teams by themselves. It could look like you lecturing to the students and asking them prompting questions as they go, and then writing their answers up on the board. It can look like different things, but the goal is to do that. Typically, when I was breaking down my lessons, I would spend about 5 to 10, if we thought of a lesson as about an hour, I would spend about 5 to 10 minutes on the I do section, then around 20 on the we do, and then 30 on the you do. So they've got 5 to 10 minutes of direct instruction, but you don't want to make your direct instruction, the I do part, too heavy. You do want to get your students participating more. So you really want to model just once or twice before you start bringing them in and having them engage with the activity themselves. So then giving a good solid amount of time for them to be engaging with the activity with their peers and with you is really helpful before they go to do it themselves. And it's essential that they get that kind of group practice, trying out those skills in a safe environment where they have you and their peers as a safety net before they start to do the work themselves. All right, any other questions? I know we've talked about model text, and we talked about writing papers in teams. Anything else that I can answer for you guys today? Okay, we just had one coming in. Getting feedback, so yeah, so it doesn't hurt, but I think you covered it. Yeah, Asha, I think the goal is just to have feedback as much as possible. So the more feedback that you can get, the less it'll hurt. It feels really scary if your boss never reaches out to you and then they say, "Oh, I want a meeting next week." You're like, "Oh man, why do they want to be with me?" Whereas if you're used to meeting with your boss constantly, then it doesn't become scary. So the more feedback you can give, and then the more often you can do it, the less scary it will become. And like I said, that's where, as a teacher, editing topics or editing technology can come in. It can help you. It can help give feedback constantly, because that's what ProWritingAid does, or editing technology does. It gives constant feedback to students. And so that way you're not having to give it, but they're still used to getting feedback. They're used to saying, "Oh, hey, here are places that you can work on your essay." And the more and more you get it, the more and more they're used to that, the more they're used to getting feedback from you. And because they've gotten it from the tool before, it's not quite as scary when you give it. All right, well, I think that is it. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm just going to drop in the chat again our list and of what we're signing up for. And you just asked, does ProWritingAid come through on a screen share in Zoom? Yep, it comes here, right? I'm in ProWritingAid on Zoom right now, so you can totally do it. Yep, totally do it online through Zoom, which is exactly what I'm doing right now. So yeah, it's super, super helpful this is exactly like what I would do if I was doing a direct instruction is I would see here and I would say, okay, here's how I am accepting suggestions. Then if I was teaching like a class, I would ask students, like if I was doing that group practice, I would come in here and I'd say, okay, ProWritingAid suggests that I have a missing comma. What should I do next? And then I would call on someone in the class. Okay, I can, accept the comma, or I might ignore that suggestion, or I'm not sure what to do. So, click here. And so I would really I would first, maybe do the first paragraph myself. Then I would release it to group control, where I'm asking students and having them kind of direct me and tell me what to do. And then finally bring it back to everybody together, and then give them the opportunity to do that themselves. I think we're all doing a lot of online learning now. Okay, all right, so that is everything that we have today. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us. Please do check out our list of upcoming events, which is in the chat. We have some really, really great sessions. We're jumping into a number of fiction writing sessions next week. We also have a ProWritingAid 101 session coming up with our founder, Chris Banks. So if you would like to come and learn from Chris about why he started the tool, as well as his best tips for using it, that will be next week. We also have a session with Sasha Black, who is a podcaster who will be talking to us all about the anatomy of successful prose. And then we just have a really great slate of things coming up over the next month and into the end of the year. So we would love to see you at them, and we will hopefully see you soon. Thank you everyone for joining me, and we will talk to you later. Bye.